I put off writing this script for 4 days. Seriously, I've been procrastinating recording the words you're hearing right now for the better part of a week. And that's kind of funny because I'm supposed to be here to talk about how to start a podcast. Well, I finally started, and now that I'm 4 sentences in, it'll probably be a lot easier. Hey, I'm John Lagomarsino, and I work on production here at Anchor. And this is a show we're calling I Should Start a Podcast, because that's what people say. I spend a lot of time helping folks get their podcasts started. Now, the technical parts of podcasting have never been easier. It's really simple to record a podcast and get it distributed really quickly. And by the way, that's what Anchor is all about. But the part that can be the trickiest is just getting started and having an idea of what your podcast actually is. So that's why we're doing this podcast that you're listening to right now, to explore how to start your podcast and make it into something your listeners will love. So over the next few episodes, we'll move all the way from ideation through recording and editing to distributing your show. At least that's my plan. I actually don't know exactly how it'll all turn out because I just started making this podcast. But the important thing is that I started with a plan. Sure, it's a really loose plan, but I have one. I took a little bit of time to think about what I want this show to be about, how to make a podcast. I thought about who it's for, people who want to make a podcast but don't know how or don't feel ready. And I know I'm going to host this show alone, with other voices occasionally mixed in to give some more perspective, like this one.
Whether it is that you're creating a podcast or you want to write a blog or anything like that, it's got to be something that you feel super enthusiastic about.
That's Abby Norman. She hosts a podcast called Let Me Google That, and she stopped by the Anchor office a few weeks ago to talk about why she makes her show.
Really what it is that this is something that I'm just really enthusiastic about. I love doing it, and I think that that's probably true of anything you're trying to commit to, is that obviously if you're, whatever you're doing, if you really love doing it and it's fun for you, it's so much easier to do it than it would be if it felt like work.
To put a finer point on it, make sure your show is about something you won't mind doing lots of episodes about. You don't necessarily need to be an expert on the subject, although it helps, but it should be something you're genuinely interested in and something you like talking about. And let's talk about that for a minute. When someone asks you what your podcast is about, you should generally be able to have an answer. A couple of people here in the Anchor office have podcasts, so I asked them exactly that question. This is Brendan Bigley. What's your podcast about?
Well, it's about Terrace House, which is a Japanese reality show that is on Netflix. It's called No Script at All, a Terrace House fan cast.
So I read a lot of Stephen King books, and about, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I started tracking all the connections between Stephen King books, and I started tracking them in a spreadsheet, and then I made a website to track them, and then I started a podcast to talk about them.
That's Maya Prahovnik. She works here too, and her podcast is called The Derry Connection.
The Derry Connection is it's a Stephen King podcast about connections between Stephen King books.
Brendan and Maya both have really clear, direct ways of answering that question. What's your podcast about? If you're having trouble answering that question in a sentence or two, that might mean you need to narrow your focus or zero in on a single aspect of your topic. What's the hook of your show? What makes it interesting and distinct and in your own voice? And it helps if you're really into the topic of your show.
It's a weird thing to say about a reality TV show, but it feels like art sometimes watching it.
It sounds like you're really into it.
I am very, very, very into it, and I can talk about it for hours or, maybe 1 hour per week even.
And that's exactly what Brendan and his co-host, Andrea Caprodi, do each week.
He's like, quote, getting back together is not an option.
That's the worst thing I've ever heard in my life.
Straight up. It's the most managerial.
Yeah.
like boardroom way of saying that we're not getting back together.
Miss Yuriko, I saw that you expressed some interest in us getting back together. Unfortunately, I looked at the budget of time that I have, and unfortunately, it's just this quarter is just not an option. Getting back together is just not an option.
I understand where you're coming from. What about next quarter?
We're actually looking to relocate next quarter.
Also, consider who your podcast is for. To put it another way, who is your audience?
I found very quickly, as I started to get very into Terrace House, that there are a lot of people on the internet who are starving for Terrace House content. People just really want to be talking about Terrace House, and it's really hard to find places to do that. And we kind of wanted to be the hub for that in a way.
And who's on your podcast? A lot of shows, especially ones that aren't scripted, work really, really well with 2 or more people. Maybe that means your podcast is an interview show, but maybe it's just co-hosted. Or maybe it's a freewheeling round table, like Maya's first episode was.
I knew I wanted it to be about connections, but I didn't think I could just talk into a microphone listing connections. I realized that most of the podcasts that I enjoy listening to is like people having silly conversations. And so for the first one, we actually did an episode. I formed a book club at Anchor, and I made 4 people here read a Stephen King book. It was The Green Mile. And we all like got together and we had some wine after work. And Brendan set up all the microphones.
All right, we ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. I haven't thought about how I was going to kick this off.
Yeah, what is it called even?
This is called the Dairy Connection podcast. Well, I think I'm going to call it Dairy Connection, a Stephen King podcast.
Oh, that's good.
For the SEO.
Yeah.
Let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Maya. I run the dairyconnection.com. Patrick.
I am Patrick.
Oh.
This is actually my first time on a podcast.
Really? Okay, don't put it in quotes. It is a podcast. Someday this is going to be the top podcast in the charts, and you're going to be very embarrassed.
All right.
That episode is super loose and fun, and it put Maya at ease. For someone just starting out, it's maybe a good idea to have a partner or 2 or 3 to bounce ideas off of and experiment together. And by the way, Anchor makes this really easy, even if you aren't all in the same room. You can use what we call Record with Friends to record with up to 10 people, just using your phones. Dave, hello.
Hello?
Yeah, it's John. What should this podcast actually be about?
Robots and, robotics.
Okay. Welcome to Robots and Robotics with John and Dave. No matter what your format is or who you're recording with, embracing messiness is totally part of the process. Think about all your ideas, get a format mapped out, think about your audience, sure. But the most important thing is to just start trying it out. Record a pilot on your phone or do an interview with someone you sort of already know, even if you have no real intention of publishing it. It'll probably be better than you think. It's important to try ideas out early, listen to the results, and iterate really quickly. Don't worry about the audio quality or the polish at the very beginning of this process. Just get an idea together and start iterating on it. That book club format that Maya did in her first episode turned out to be way different from her later episodes, where she just had one friend on at a time. But just getting the process started and trying things out got her closer to a format she felt great about.
Sometimes I wish that I had done like a sort of test episode or something just to figure out those kinks. But I also looking back on it now, it's nice for me being able to see the how my podcast has grown since then.
This is the same advice I would give anyone about any creative project.
Brendan again.
Just start doing it so you can learn what you need to be fixing and improving on. I tend to find, at least in the podcasting space, it's sometimes better to record your first episode 2 or 3 times before you record an actual first episode that you end up releasing.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Not as much when you're having a good time doing it.
This episode you're listening to right now probably went through a ton of revisions before we landed on a sound and a format. I'm recording this sentence knowing that I might change it later, or that the sentences I recorded just before this one might be cut and replaced by the time you hear them. It's messy and a little bit scary, but that's something everyone goes through at the beginning. The trick is just to be okay with that and start actually making your podcast. So take a breath, think for a couple of minutes, and hit record. We can't wait to hear what you make. All right, that's one episode in the can. I Should Start a Podcast is a production of Anchor, the easiest way to make a podcast. You can sign up right now and start creating at anchor.fm. Next time on the show, we'll go over how to actually record your podcast, what mics to use, where to record, all that stuff. So if you have any questions about recording, or if you just want to let me know how wrong I was about something in this episode, you can leave me a voice message right in Anchor, and we may even play that on the next episode. So to do that, just download the Anchor mobile app, search for I Should Start a Podcast to find the show, and tap the message button. It's super easy, and I really would like to hear what you think, or the questions that you might have. Thanks to all the podcasters in this episode. Abby Norman's show is called Let Me Google That. Maya's Stephen King podcast is called The Dairy Connection. And Brendan's Terrace House show is no script at all. Brendan also produced all the music in this episode, and you can find it on Bandcamp under his artistic pseudonym, Bokeh. You can find links to all of that stuff in the show description. All right, we did it. Thanks for listening. I'm John Lagomarsino, and I'll be back real soon with another episode of I Should Start a Podcast. Talk to you then.